Intrepid journalists have made shocking and credible allegations of extensive fraud in Minnesota's child care program.
He's uncovering tens of millions of dollars in fraud at Minneapolis daycares run by the Somali community.
Local and federal authorities ramping up investigations into alleged social services fraud in Minnesota.
At 6:17 this morning, federal agents confirmed the largest welfare fraud operation ever dismantled on American soil. $110 million. Exposed by a citizen journalist with a camera. Funneled through empty daycare centers across Minnesota. And at the center of it all, a network that federal investigators now believe has direct financial ties to overseas terror financing operations. This is not a story about paperwork errors. This is not bureaucratic incompetence. This is engineered theft from American taxpayers, executed with surgical precision, protected by silence, and exposed only because one man refused to look away. His name is Nick Shirley. And what he uncovered will change how you see the system forever. It began 18 months ago, in a strip mall parking lot on the outskirts of Minneapolis. Shirley, an independent investigative journalist known for his undercover work exposing institutional fraud, had received an anonymous tip. The message was simple. Drive past any daycare center in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood during business hours. Count the children. Then check the state funding records. What he found was impossible to explain. A daycare center licensed for 92 children. State records showing full enrollment. Federal meal reimbursement claims for breakfast, lunch, and 2 snacks daily. But when Shirley parked across the street with a camera at 10:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, he counted 0 children entering or leaving over a 4-hour window. The building was dark. The playground was empty. The only movement was a single car that arrived at 2:15 p.m., stayed for 6 minutes, and left. He visited another center the next day. Same pattern. Licensed for 78 children. Full enrollment on paper. 0 children visible. The windows were covered with black curtains. The front door had 3 deadbolts. Over the following weeks, Shirley documented more than 40 daycare centers across the Twin Cities metropolitan area. The pattern was identical. State licenses. Federal funding. Empty buildings. Ghost children. The numbers were staggering. According to documents Shirley obtained through public records requests, these 43 centers alone had received more than $62 million in federal child care assistance funds over a 3-year period. Meals that were never served. Staff that never existed. Children whose names appeared on enrollment rosters but who, investigators would later discover, had never set foot inside the facilities. Some of the children listed didn't exist at all. Their social security numbers were fabricated. Their birth certificates were forgeries purchased from document mills operating out of East Africa. But here's where it gets worse. Shirley didn't just find empty daycare centers. He found a financial pipeline. When federal agents finally moved on the network this morning, they discovered that the fraud extended far beyond childcare subsidies. The same shell companies receiving daycare funds were also collecting payments from federal food assistance programs, housing vouchers, educational grants, and small business pandemic relief loans. The total exposure now exceeds $110 million. And investigators believe that number will climb as forensic accountants trace additional accounts. At 4:34 a.m., more than 200 federal agents from the FBI, IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General launched coordinated raids across 7 Minnesota counties. They hit 53 locations simultaneously. Daycare centers, private residences, commercial office buildings, a warehouse in Brooklyn Park that had been converted into what agents now describe as a document fabrication facility. Inside that warehouse, investigators found industrial-grade printing equipment capable of producing state-certified child care licenses, federal employer identification numbers, and forged birth certificates. They found boxes containing more than 12,000 blank Social Security cards. They found computers loaded with software designed to generate synthetic identities, complete with fabricated employment histories, medical records, and family documentation. The operation was not amateur. It was industrial. Federal agents arrested 19 individuals in the initial sweep. But the investigation's primary target, a woman identified in court documents as Halima Farah Osman, was not among them. Osman, who allegedly served as the network's financial coordinator, was last seen boarding a flight from Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport to Dubai 6 days before the raids. Authorities believe she was tipped off. An internal investigation is now underway to determine how. The money trail leads somewhere far more disturbing than simple greed. According to sealed federal affidavits obtained by investigators, a significant portion of the stolen funds did not remain in the United States. Wire transfers totaling more than $47 million were routed through a series of shell companies in Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, and Kenya before arriving at their final destination. Bank accounts in Mogadishu, Somalia. Federal analysts now believe the Daycare fraud network was not operating in isolation. It was functioning as one node in a larger financial apparatus designed to move American taxpayer dollars overseas while evading detection. The system worked like this. Fraudulent daycare centers would submit reimbursement claims to Minnesota's Department of Human Services. The state, overwhelmed by application volume and understaffed in its fraud prevention unit, would approve payments with minimal verification. The funds would be deposited into business accounts controlled by network members. Within 72 hours, the money would be transferred to personal accounts, then wired overseas through currency exchanges and hawala networks, an informal money transfer system commonly used in East Africa and the Middle East that leaves minimal paper trail. By the time auditors noticed discrepancies, the money was gone. Converted to cash.
Untraceable.
Think about that for a moment. American taxpayer dollars, allocated to feed and educate children, were instead being siphoned through ghost facilities and shipped halfway around the world. And it happened for years. Right under the nose of state regulators. How long had this been happening?
Who else knew?
And why did no one stop it? The answers to those questions point to failures at every level of oversight. Internal documents obtained by federal investigators reveal that Minnesota's Department of Human Services received multiple fraud complaints about Somali-owned daycare centers as early as 2019. Whistleblowers within the agency flagged statistical anomalies. Enrollment numbers that didn't match population data. Meal claims that exceeded physical capacity. Facilities that appeared inactive during business hours. Those complaints were not investigated.
They were filed, buried, forgotten.
One former DHS employee, speaking on condition of anonymity, told investigators that supervisors actively discouraged fraud referrals involving immigrant-owned businesses. The stated reason was cultural sensitivity. The practical effect was a blind spot large enough to drive $110 million through. But the failure wasn't just bureaucratic.
It was structural.
Federal investigators have now identified at least 7 state employees who received payments from accounts linked to the fraud network, 2 licensing supervisors, 3 program auditors, a data analyst with access to enrollment verification systems, and 1 senior manager who allegedly approved facility licenses without conducting required site inspections. Each received between $15,000 and $73,000 over a 2-year period. Payments were disguised as consulting fees, cultural liaison services, and translation contracts. The money came from the same shell companies receiving federal daycare funds.
This wasn't negligence.
This was engineered protection. At 9:42 a.m., federal prosecutors announced charges against 47 individuals in connection with the fraud scheme. The charges include wire fraud, money laundering, identity theft, and conspiracy to defraud the United States. If convicted, several defendants face sentences exceeding 30 years. But the investigation is far from over. Analysts combing through seized computers discovered a master spreadsheet listing more than 300 additional daycare facilities across Minnesota, Wisconsin, Ohio, and Arizona. Each facility was coded with enrollment targets, funding projections, and assigned coordinators. The document was titled Phase 2 Expansion. According to federal estimates, if the network had continued operating undetected, it could have extracted more than $500 million from federal assistance programs over the next decade. The infrastructure was already in place. The document fabrication systems were scalable. The money laundering channels were established. The only thing that stopped them was a man with a camera. Nick Shirley's investigation, conducted without federal resources, without subpoena power, without institutional support, accomplished what years of government oversight failed to achieve. He exposed a fraud so massive that it forced federal agencies to act. His footage went viral.
Empty playgrounds. Locked doors.
State licenses hanging in windows of buildings that hadn't seen a child in years. The contrast between official enrollment numbers and visible reality was undeniable. Within weeks, his reporting had reached millions. Congressional hearings were scheduled. State officials were forced to answer questions they had been avoiding for years. If you believe investigative journalism still matters, hit that like button right now. Because this story only exists because one person refused to accept the official narrative. The human cost of this fraud extends far beyond budget spreadsheets. Every dollar stolen from childcare assistance programs is a dollar that didn't reach a working mother trying to afford quality care for her children. Every fraudulent meal claim is a meal that was never served to a hungry child. Every fake enrollment slot is a real family that was waitlisted, denied, or forced to find inadequate alternatives. Federal investigators estimate that the fraud network's activities displaced services for more than 8,000 legitimate families over the past 5 years. Children who could have received developmental support. Parents who could have maintained employment. Communities that could have built stronger foundations. Instead, the money went overseas. And the people who were supposed to be watching said nothing. But here's what kept investigators awake through the night. The seized computers contained more than financial records. They contained communications. Encrypted messages between network coordinators and overseas contacts. Discussions about expanding operations into housing assistance programs, medical reimbursement schemes, and federal student aid. Plans to recruit additional state employees into the protection network. And one file that made federal analysts pause. A document outlining payments to 3 individuals identified only by initials. Individuals whose communication patterns suggest they hold current positions within federal oversight agencies. Individuals who may have been providing advance warning of audits, investigations, and enforcement actions. The moles have not been identified. The internal investigation continues. But federal agents are now operating under the assumption that the network had eyes inside the system at multiple levels. The Minnesota fraud network has been disrupted. But investigators believe it was just one branch of a larger apparatus. Similar patterns have been flagged in Arizona, Ohio, Texas, and Washington state. The same document fabrication techniques. The same shell company structures. The same overseas money trails. The architects of that larger system are still operating. Commissioner Margaret Thornton, the fictional head of Minnesota's Department of Human Services, resigned this morning without public comment. Her deputy is under federal investigation. The governor's office has announced a complete restructuring of fraud prevention protocols. But restructuring takes time. And the networks don't wait. Somewhere tonight, in a strip mall parking lot in another American city, there's a daycare center with blackout curtains and triple locked doors. State records show full enrollment. Federal funds are being deposited monthly. And no child has ever walked through that door. Power doesn't always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it just files paperwork.
Submits claims.
Waits for the deposit to clear. And trusts that no one is watching. Nick Shirley was watching. And because of that, 47 people are in federal custody tonight. $110 million in fraud has been exposed. And a conversation that government agencies refuse to have is now impossible to ignore. But the question remains. How many more ghost children are on enrollment rosters right now? How many more empty buildings are collecting taxpayer funds? How many more networks are operating in the blind spots that bureaucratic cowardice creates? If you want this investigation to continue, subscribe now.
Because this story is not over.
The documents are still being decrypted. The money trails are still being traced. And the names that emerge next may be far more powerful than anyone expects.
Stay vigilant.
Because the next facility you drive past, the one with the license in the window and the empty playground, might not be what it claims to be. And somewhere tonight, Phase 2 is already being planned.